I tightened the final bolt on the external sensor array, my gloved fingers working with practiced efficiency despite the biting cold. The Polaris's sleek hull gleamed under the harsh lights of the preparation bay, its reinforced viewport reflecting my concentrated expression back at me. "How's it looking, Seth?" Gail called from the monitoring station, not looking up from her tablet. "Almost there," I replied, running my hand along the sealed edge of the sensor housing. "Just want to double-check the integrity of the external mounts before we go." The Arctic Research Station Theta hummed around us with the constant mechanical breath of heating systems fighting against the brutal outside temperatures. 3 weeks we'd been here, and I still hadn't fully acclimated to the perpetual chill that seemed to seep through the station's walls. But today that didn't matter. Today we were finally going to see what lay beneath. I climbed down from the submersible's side and walked around to the main hatch, mentally reviewing the checklist I'd already gone through twice. The Polaris wasn't particularly large as research vessels went. A 12-foot titanium cylinder with a bulbous viewport and articulated sampling arms, but it represented years of design work and the cutting edge of deep-water exploration technology. More importantly, it was my ticket to the unmapped thermal vent system we'd detected last month. Greg appeared at my side, handing me the waterproof tablet containing the mission parameters. "You sure about this? The ice mapping is still preliminary," he said, his voice carrying that mix of professional concern and personal worry I'd come to expect from him. "That's why we're doing a short reconnaissance dive first," I said, scrolling through the depth charts one more time. "Just enough to confirm the thermal signature and get some initial readings." Greg nodded, though his expression remained doubtful. At 29, he was the youngest member of our team, but his technical expertise had proven invaluable during the preparation phase. He'd personally overseen the calibration of the Polaris's navigation systems to account for the unusual magnetic fluctuations we'd detected in this region. Gail walked over, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in her customary tight bun. As the project lead, she carried the weight of responsibility for both the mission and the team, something reflected in the careful way she examined every detail of the submersible. "Let's go over the protocols one more time," she said, pulling up her own copy of the mission parameters. "Maximum depth authorization is 500 meters. Primary objective is to locate and collect data from the thermal anomaly. If at any point your communications are compromised, I surface immediately," I finished for her. "I know, Gail. We've been over this." She gave me a level look. "Humor me, Seth. We don't have good data on what's down there, and the ice formations in this region are unpredictable." I nodded, accepting the rebuke. Gail had been my mentor for nearly a decade, and I respected her methodical approach, even when my own curiosity pushed me to move faster. She handed me a cylindrical package about the size of my forearm. "The new sensor array is calibrated to detect minute temperature variations and water composition changes. It should give us a comprehensive picture of the vent activity." I took the package, feeling its substantial weight. "Did the modifications to the spectrometer hold up in the cold tests?" "Better than expected," she replied. "You should be able to get real-time chemical composition analysis as you approach the vent." The intercoms crackled to life. "Weather update. Barometric pressure dropping, wind speeds increasing to 30 knots. Expedition window narrowing to approximately 4 hours. Gail frowned at the ceiling speaker, then turned back to me. "You heard that. No extended exploration today, no matter what you find. Get the initial readings and come back up." "Copy that," I said, securing the sensor package in its designated compartment inside the submersible. Greg helped me with the final pre-dive checks, his movements efficient and precise. "Life support is green. Emergency oxygen reserves at 100%. hydraulics, and maneuvering thrusters all responding normally. I climbed into the Polaris, settling into the padded seat that would be my home for the next few hours. The control panel lit up as I initiated the power sequence, dozens of indicators changing from amber to green as systems came online. Greg leaned into the hatch opening. "Stay away from the larger ice formations. Some of those things are like underwater mountains, and they shift more than you'd think." "I'll keep my distance," I promised. "And watch your depth rate," he added, his brow furrowed with concern. "The pressure differential readings we got yesterday suggest there might be some unusual currents down there." I nodded, appreciating his thoroughness even as I was eager to get started. "I'll take it slow." Gale appeared behind him. "Communications check every 15 minutes. If we lose contact for more than 30 minutes, we're initiating recovery procedures." "Understood," I said, running through the final internal diagnostics. All systems were operational, the Polaris humming with readiness around me. Greg sealed the hatch, the heavy clunk of the locking mechanism, followed by the hiss of the pressure equalizing. I was alone now, enclosed in the quiet cocoon of the submersible, only the soft electronic chirps of the monitoring equipment breaking the silence. I initiated the launch sequence, feeling the slight lurch as the mechanical arms of the deployment system lifted the Polaris and moved it toward the moon pool, our access point to the waters below the station. The radio crackled. "Polaris, you are clear for descent. Good luck down there." "Copy that, base. Beginning descent now," I replied, activating the ballast system. The submersible broke the surface of the moon pool, and I was immediately surrounded by the dark Arctic waters. I switched on the external lights, illuminating a world of swirling ice particles and the underside of the thick ice sheet above. Daylight filtered through in pale blue shafts that grew dimmer as I descended, the ballast tanks filling smoothly to pull me deeper into the darkness. At 50 meters, the light from the surface was a distant memory, replaced by the powerful beams of the Polaris's external array. I navigated carefully, keeping a close eye on the sonar display that mapped the underwater terrain around me. Massive ice formations loomed like abstract sculptures, their surfaces textured with ridges and hollows carved by currents. The temperature gauge showed -2 degrees Celsius, standard for Arctic waters, as I continued my controlled descent. The depth meter ticked steadily upward, 100 meters, 150 meters, 200 meters. At 250 meters, I noticed the first anomaly. The external temperature sensor registered a slight increase, only a fraction of a degree. But in waters that had maintained a consistent temperature, even that small change was significant. I adjusted course, following the gradient toward what I hoped was the thermal vent we detected from surface readings. The sonar showed a channel ahead, a passage between two massive ice formations that extended downward like inverted mountains. I navigated through carefully, mindful of Greg's warnings about the unpredictable nature of these underwater ice structures. At 300 meters, the temperature jumped again, more dramatically this time, nearly 2 degrees warmer than the surrounding water. The change was visible even without instruments. The warmer water created a distortion effect, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. I reached for the radio. "Base, this is Polaris. I'm tracking a significant thermal anomaly at 300 meters. Temperature reading at +0.3 degrees Celsius. Gale's voice came back, tinged with excitement despite her professional tone. "Copy that, Polaris. Are you seeing any visual indicators of the vent itself?" "Negative," I replied, maneuvering the submersible to follow the warmer water. "But I'm detecting what appears to be a current, an underwater river flowing beneath the ice. It's remarkably defined, with clear boundaries between it and the surrounding water." I activated the sensor package Gale had provided, extending the sampling probe into the warm current. Data began streaming across one of my monitors. Dissolved mineral content, salinity, oxygen levels. The readings confirmed what I was seeing. This was not typical Arctic water. Base, I'm sending you the preliminary data now. This current has chemical properties consistent with geothermal activity, elevated sulfur compounds, increased mineral content. Temperature continuing to rise as I follow the flow. The radio crackled with static for a moment before Gale's voice returned. Receiving your data, Polaris. These readings are unexpected. The mineral composition suggests a much more active vent system than we anticipated. I guided the Polaris deeper along the warm current, which now appeared as a distinct flow against the darker surrounding waters. The submersible's external lights illuminated particles suspended in the water, minerals and organic matter swirling in the thermal flow. That was when I noticed the fish. Small Arctic cod darting through the beam of my lights in numbers I wouldn't have expected at this depth. But their behavior was what caught my attention. They weren't swimming randomly or in the normal patterns of a school. They were moving with purpose, with urgency, all in the same direction, away from something deeper in the warm current. I watched, fascinated, as another group shot past the viewport, their silver bodies flashing in the submersible's lights. Their movement wasn't casual exploration or feeding behavior. They were fleeing. Base, I'm observing unusual marine life activity, I reported, tracking the fish with the external camera. Multiple schools of what appear to be Arctic cod, moving rapidly up current. Their behavior suggests they're retreating from something downstream. What kind of numbers are we talking about? Greg's voice came through this time. More than I'd expect at this depth and temperature, I replied, adjusting the Polaris's heading to follow the direction the fish were coming from. And they're moving with purpose, not typical schooling behavior. I checked my instruments again. Depth, 320 meters. External temperature, plus 1.2 degrees Celsius. Oxygen levels in the water, higher than normal. All indicators of an active and significant geothermal system. The fish continued to stream past, their numbers increasing. Whatever was driving them must be ahead, in the direction I was now heading. Scientific curiosity overrode caution as I propelled the Polaris deeper along the thermal current, following the reverse path of the fleeing marine life. I'm going to investigate the source of this behavior, I informed Base, adjusting the submersible's external lights to their maximum brightness to penetrate the murky water ahead. Maintaining current depth, but proceeding along the thermal flow, the Polaris glided forward, its powerful lights cutting through the darkness, illuminating more fish racing toward me and past the submersible. I kept my eyes fixed on the viewport and the instruments, searching for whatever might be causing this unusual behavior in an environment where life typically moved with much more caution. I guided the Polaris deeper into the thermal current, adjusting the ballast to maintain a steady descent. The temperature readings continued to climb, a full 8 degrees above the surrounding Arctic waters. This wasn't just a minor anomaly. It was an underwater oasis, a hidden pocket of warmth in one of Earth's coldest environments. My external floodlights cut through the darkness, revealing something I hadn't expected. Life. Not just the schools of Arctic cod I'd spotted earlier, but an entire ecosystem thriving in this thermal pocket. Bright red anemones clung to rocky outcroppings. Unusual crustaceans skittered across the seafloor. Even some species of coral that had no business being this far north spread in colorful patches along the thermal gradient. Base, this is Polaris, I said into my comm. Are you receiving the video feed? I'm documenting an entire ecosystem that appears to have developed around this thermal vent. Greg's voice crackled back. Copy that, Seth. Data coming through. Dr. Cruz is analyzing it now. I adjusted course to follow the core of the warm current, which flowed like an underwater river through the colder Arctic waters. The navigation system showed we were approaching the 400-meter mark, still within our authorized depth, but getting closer to our limit. I made a note in the log and continued collecting samples of the water chemistry. Something was off about the fish behavior. The Arctic cod that had initially caught my attention weren't just swimming in the current. They were darting erratically, changing direction in unison, like a nervous school evading a predator. But I couldn't spot anything pursuing them. Base. Fish behavior is unusual. They appear to be fleeing from something downstream in the current. Can you identify any predators in the area? Gale asked. Negative. Nothing visible yet, but... I stopped mid-sentence. My floodlights had caught something in the distance. At first, it was just a vague shape, a darker patch against the already dark water. I adjusted the Polaris's heading to move closer, thinking perhaps it was another research vessel. The Norwegian team had mentioned they might be working in this quadrant, though they shouldn't be this deep. I squinted at the viewport, then checked my sonar. The reading made no sense. The object was massive, at least 40 feet in length. Base. I'm picking up a large mass approximately 200 meters ahead. Initial read suggests it might be another submersible, but the size is unusual. I reduced speed, approaching cautiously. As I drew closer, the floodlights revealed more of the shape. It wasn't static. It was moving. Not with the mechanical precision of a submarine, but with the fluid, purposeful motion of something alive. My breath caught as I realized what I was seeing. The creature was enormous, far larger than any fish that should exist in these waters. Its body was streamlined, with a distinctive dorsal fin cutting through the water. The powerful tail propelled it in a lazy patrol pattern. But it was the shape of its head that sent a chill through me despite the warming temperature inside the Polaris. It was a shark, but not just any shark. Base, I said, my voice barely steady. I need you to confirm what I'm seeing. I adjusted the external cameras to get a clearer image. I'm observing what appears to be a megalodon. There was a long pause before Greg responded. Seth, repeat your last. Did you say megalodon? Affirmative. I zoomed the camera in on the creature. I'm looking at a shark species that matches all physical characteristics of Carcharicles megalodon. Estimated length between 40 and 50 feet. Distinctive broad snout, triangular serrated teeth visible when it opens its mouth. This isn't a Greenland shark or a basking shark. This shouldn't be possible. Seth, this is Gale. Dr. Cruz's voice now, skeptical but measured. Are you certain of your identification? Megalodons have been extinct for over 2 million years. I'm well aware of that, Dr. Cruz. I kept my eyes fixed on the massive predator as it swam in a wide circle. But I'm telling you what I'm seeing. This is a living, breathing megalodon. Everything is being recorded. You can see the feed. We're seeing it, she confirmed, her tone shifting from skepticism to astonishment. But how is this possible? How could it have survived undetected? I watched the creature's movement pattern, noting something crucial. It's staying within the thermal current. Look at its patrol route. It follows the temperature boundary exactly. I maneuvered the Polaris in a wide arc, maintaining a safe distance, but keeping the prehistoric shark in view. The creature seemed unbothered by my presence, perhaps not registering the submersible as either threat or prey. The thermal current, I said, thinking aloud now. It's not just a habitat. It's a containment system. Natural boundaries formed by temperature gradients. I pulled up the thermal imaging on my secondary screen. The warm current showed as a ribbon of red and orange cutting through the blue-purple cold of the surrounding Arctic water. The megalodon swam precisely within those warm boundaries, never crossing into the colder waters. I think I understand, I continued. This thermal vent has likely been active for millions of years, creating a microclimate, a pocket of survivable water temperature. This megalodon, or more likely its ancestors, found this pocket and adapted to life within it. It's a living fossil, preserved in this thermal enclave since prehistoric times. A temperature-controlled evolutionary island, Gale said, the scientific excitement evident in her voice despite the static. The thermal current is both its home and its prison. Exactly. I adjusted the Polaris's position to get a better angle on the creature. It can't leave the warm water. Its physiology probably wouldn't survive the temperature drop. That's why it's never been detected before. It physically cannot venture beyond this thermal pocket. The megalodon turned suddenly, its massive tail propelling it in a new direction, directly toward a school of fish that had ventured too close. The speed of the attack was breathtaking. For something so large, it moved with incredible precision, its jaws opening to reveal rows of teeth the size of my hand. The water churned as fish scattered, but several were caught in that prehistoric maw. "My God," I whispered. "Its hunting pattern is perfectly preserved, exactly as paleontologists theorized." "Seth," Greg's voice came through with a note of caution. "Remember the mission parameters. You're there to observe the thermal anomaly, not to." "This is the thermal anomaly," I interrupted. "Or at least it explains why this thermal current has remained undetected. Any previous explorers who might have stumbled upon it probably never returned to report their findings." I continued documenting the megalodon's behavior, measuring its size against known reference points, recording its swimming patterns and speed. This was the scientific discovery of a lifetime, a living specimen of a species believed extinct for millions of years. "I'm going to circle around to the eastern edge of the thermal pocket," I reported. "I want to map the full extent of its territory and—" The Polaris suddenly lurched violently to one side. I grabbed the control panel to steady myself as warning lights flashed across the console, red and yellow indicators blinking in urgent patterns. "What the hell?" I checked the system diagnostics, scanning for the source of the problem. The hull integrity warning was flashing along with alerts from the ballast system. The submersible shuddered again, more violently this time. Something had gone very wrong, very quickly. "Base, we've got a problem." I gripped the control panel as the Polaris shuddered again. "Multiple system failures occurring. Primary thermal regulation is offline." The radio crackled with static before Greg's voice came through. "Copy that. What systems are affected?" I ran a quick diagnostic, scanning the blinking alerts on my console. "Thermal regulation failing. Hull integrity compromised at Section 4. Ballast system showing inconsistent pressure readings." I tapped the screen, bringing up more detailed information. "Something hit us, or we hit something." "What about your position relative to the thermal anomaly?" Gale's voice replaced Greg's, her tone tight with concern. "Still within the current, approximately 380 meters deep." I checked the external temperature gauge. External water is holding at +8 degrees Celsius within the current. The cabin lights dimmed momentarily, then brightened again. A new warning flashed red on my display. "Cabin heating system is going offline," I reported, my breath already visible as mist in front of my face. Temperature dropping quickly. The thermal control system was essential in these waters. Even within this unusual warm current, the Polaris needed to maintain its internal environment. Without it, the Arctic cold would seep through the metal hull within minutes. "Attempting manual restart of thermal systems," I said. flipping the emergency override switches beneath the main console. Nothing happened. No response. The temperature inside the cabin had already dropped several degrees. I zipped my thermal jacket higher, pulling the collar up around my neck. "Seth, listen carefully," Gale said. "You need to initiate emergency protocols. Divert power from non-essential systems to life support and propulsion." I was already doing exactly that, rerouting power from the external research equipment. On it. External sensors and sample collection systems offline, diverting all available power. The cabin continued to cool at an alarming rate. I rubbed my hands together, trying to keep my fingers nimble enough to work the controls. My breath came out in increasingly visible clouds as the temperature plunged. "Temperature still dropping," I reported. "Down to 15 Celsius in the cabin and falling." Greg's voice came back online. "Seth, what about the creature? Any sign of it?" I looked up from the controls to peer through the viewport. The external lights cut through the murky water, illuminating the surrounding area. At first, I saw nothing but the swirling currents and scattered marine life. Then I spotted it. The megalodon had been maintaining its distance, seemingly uninterested in the Polaris. But now it had changed course. The massive shark executed a slow, deliberate turn in the water. Its enormous body, easily 40 feet long, moved with surprising grace as it began to circle the submersible. "The megalodon, it's changing behavior," I said, watching as the prehistoric predator completed one full circle around the Polaris. "It's showing interest in us now." I frantically worked the controls, trying to restore power to the thermal regulation system while keeping an eye on the circling shark. The creature's movements were becoming more purposeful, its circles tightening. I paused as realization hit me. The thermal signature. The Polaris normally maintains an external hull temperature consistent with the surrounding water. With the thermal regulation system offline, our heat signature must be changing. The megalodon completed another circle, closer this time. I could see its ancient eyes, black and emotionless, as it passed the viewport. "It can sense our changing thermal profile," I continued. "The shark's detecting us now that our thermal masking is gone." "Seth, you need to get out of there," Gale urged. "Use the emergency propulsion system." "Working on it," I replied, fingers flying across the controls. "Trying to..." The world turned upside down. The impact came without warning. A massive force slamming into the side of the Polaris. I was thrown from my seat, crashing hard against the control panel. Metal groaned as the submersible spun violently in the water. Warning alarms blared as I pulled myself up, feeling something warm and wet running down my face. I touched my forehead, and my fingers came away red. A cut above my right eye was bleeding steadily. Seth, do you copy?" Greg's voice was almost lost in the cacophony of alarms. I stumbled back to the pilot's seat. "Still here. The megalodon just rammed us." I wiped blood from my eye. "Hit my head in the impact. I'm bleeding but conscious." The external lights flickered wildly, plunging the surrounding water into intermittent darkness. For terrifying seconds, I couldn't see anything beyond the viewport. Then the light stabilized, revealing the massive shape of the megalodon as it circled for another pass. "Lights back online," I reported. "I can see the creature. It's circling again." I quickly assessed the damage reports flooding my screen. The hull had held, but several systems were now completely offline. The Polaris listed to one side, its ballast tanks compromised. "Attempting to restart propulsion," I said, initiating the emergency restart sequence. The engines had shut down during the impact. Come on. The control panel lit up as the engines sputtered back to life. Relief washed over me as I felt the familiar vibration beneath my feet. Propulsion restored, I reported, but the heating system is completely offline. Can't get it to restart. What's your cabin temperature? Gale asked. I checked the reading. 9 degrees Celsius and still falling. I was shivering now, the cold seeping through my thermal gear. External hull temperature is dropping too, making us stand out even more to the Megalodon. With the engines back online, I carefully maneuvered the damaged Polaris away from the circling Predator. The submersible responded sluggishly, the damaged ballast system making it difficult to control our buoyancy and direction. I'm trying to move back toward the research station, I said, guiding the Polaris on a course I hoped would lead to safety. The submersible drifted forward, painfully slow compared to its usual capabilities. I kept one eye on the navigation system and one on the external cameras tracking the Megalodon. The creature followed at a distance, its massive body cutting through the water with effortless power. As I guided the damaged vessel, I noticed the external temperature readings beginning to drop. We were approaching the edge of the thermal current, the boundary between the warm microclimate and the lethal cold of the Arctic deep. Seth, what's your position? Greg asked. Approaching the edge of the thermal current, I replied, watching the temperature gauge closely. External temperature dropping rapidly, down to 5 degrees, now 3. I eased off on the propulsion, bringing the Polaris to a stop just before the temperature plummeted further. Beyond this point, the water temperature would drop to below 0. Standard for these Arctic depths, but deadly for both the Megalodon and potentially for me in the failing submersible. I've stopped at the boundary, I reported. Can't proceed further without functioning thermal regulation. The water temperature drops to negative out there. I glanced behind me, and the Megalodon is still behind us, staying within the warm current. I sat back in my seat, the full reality of my situation sinking in. Blood continued to trickle down my face from the cut above my eye. The cabin temperature had fallen to 6 degrees Celsius, and my fingers were starting to lose feeling. My breath hung in clouds before my face. I'm trapped, I said, my voice steady despite the dire circumstances. If I stay here at the edge, the life support will eventually fail as the cabin temperature continues to drop. But if I go back into the thermal current to stay warm... I watched the massive shadow of the Megalodon circling just behind me, waiting. The shark is there, I finished. Either way, I'm running out of options. The Megalodon circled at the edge of the thermal boundary, its massive eyes tracking the Polaris with an intelligence I hadn't expected. Each time it completed a circuit, it paused directly in front of my viewport, close enough that I could see the rows of serrated teeth behind its slightly parted jaws. This wasn't random behavior, it was hunting strategy. I keyed the radio with fingers that had started to stiffen from the cold. Base, this is Seth. Our situation is getting worse. We're here, Seth. Gale's voice came through, steady but strained. What's your status? The Megalodon is patrolling the thermal boundary. I wiped blood from my eye with my sleeve. It's not leaving. It's just... waiting. What do you mean, waiting? Greg's voice now, concern evident. I watched as the creature completed another lazy circle. It knows I can't stay here in the cold water, and I can't go forward into colder water without thermal regulation. If I go back into the warm current, I'm right in its territory. I exhaled, my breath clouding in front of my face. It's a standoff, but one I'm going to lose. This thing understands the situation better than I want to admit. That's impossible, Gale said. It can't possibly. It's showing predatory intelligence, I cut in. It's happened before in other apex species. The megalodon has had millions of years to evolve in this isolated ecosystem. It's adapted. The radio was silent for a moment. When Gail spoke again, her tone had changed. "What's your cabin temperature?" I checked the display. 3 degrees Celsius and dropping. Frost is forming on the interior surfaces. I ran my finger along the edge of the control panel, collecting a thin layer of ice crystals. My breath is visible now. "Seth, you need to get out of there," Greg said. "The hypothermia risk." "I know the risks," I said, watching as the megalodon made another pass. "But I need to think this through. Going back means certain death. Moving forward means certain death. Staying here means delayed death." I turned away from the viewport and began a systematic check of the remaining operational systems. Most of the display panels showed red warnings, but a few still glowed green. Life support was functioning at minimal capacity. Propulsion was online but weakened. Communications were stable. And then I noticed something interesting. "The chemical de-icer tanks are still operational," I said, more to myself than to the radio. "What was that?" Gail asked. "The de-icer system." I leaned closer to the readout. It was designed to prevent ice buildup on the external sensors and mechanical joints. It's still working. I started running calculations in my head. The de-icer wasn't meant for what I was considering, but with modifications. "I might have a way out," I said. "What are you thinking?" Greg asked. "I need some time." I didn't want to explain half-formed ideas. "Let me work on this." I switched off the radio and focused on the task at hand. The cabin grew colder as I worked, my fingers becoming increasingly clumsy as I tried to reroute systems and modify the de-icer deployment. The cut above my eye had stopped bleeding, but the blood had frozen into a crust that pulled at my skin whenever I frowned in concentration. Time blurred as I worked. 2 hours passed in what felt like both minutes and days. The cabin temperature dropped below freezing, reaching -2°C. Ice crystals formed on my eyelashes. My breathing became labored as my body fought to maintain core temperature. During breaks from the repair work, I monitored the megalodon through the viewport. Its behavior was fascinating, even in my dire circumstances. Occasionally it would venture slightly beyond the thermal boundary, testing the colder water, only to quickly retreat to the warmth of the current. The behavior confirmed my theory. The creature was adapted to the thermal pocket but couldn't survive in the freezing Arctic waters beyond. This was the foundation of my plan. If I could somehow survive the cold long enough. My fingers were nearly useless now, numb and clumsy. Simple tasks took 3 times longer than they should have. I dropped tools, fumbled connections, and had to repeat steps multiple times. But gradually, my modifications took shape. I keyed the radio again. "Base, this is Seth." "Seth," Greg's voice came through immediately. "We were getting worried. It's been over 2 hours since your last communication." "I've been busy," I said, my words slightly slurred from the cold. "I've got a plan." "What kind of plan?" Gail asked, her tone cautious. "I've modified the de-icer system to create a temporary thermal shield. If I can get the Polaris moving fast enough, I might be able to make it through the cold zone before the shield fails." "And the megalodon?" Greg asked. "It won't follow. It can't survive outside its thermal pocket for long. I've watched it test the boundaries. It retreats within seconds." "Seth, your oxygen levels are critical," Gail said, her voice sharp with concern. "The last data transmission showed your life support systems are failing. You need to surface immediately. We've got a rescue team standing by." "A rescue team can't reach me in time," I said. "Even if they could launch now, it would take hours to reach my position. By then," I left the sentence unfinished. We all knew what would happen. Your core temperature must be dropping into dangerous territory, Gale continued. The symptoms of hypothermia. I know the symptoms, I interrupted. Confusion, poor decision-making, eventual loss of consciousness. But I'm still thinking clearly enough to know this is my only option. I could hear them conferring off mic, their voices muffled but tense. When Gale came back, her tone was firm. Seth, as your supervisor, I'm ordering you to abort whatever you're planning and begin emergency ascent procedures. I watched the megalodon make another pass in front of the viewport. I'm sorry, Gale. There's no time left. The Polaris's systems are failing faster than predicted. The temperature is dropping. I'm showing early signs of hypothermia. I flexed my stiff fingers, trying to restore circulation. I need to try this now, or I won't be able to try it at all. Seth, I'm implementing my plan, I said firmly. I've calculated the risks as best I can with the data available. This is the only viable option. I reached for the modified controls, my movements slow but determined. The megalodon continued its patrol outside, unaware that its waiting game was about to end. Stand by, base. I'm activating the thermal shield. I gripped the controls and pushed the Polaris forward, back toward the thermal current where the megalodon waited. My fingers were stiff with cold, and frost had formed on my eyelashes, making it hard to blink. The cabin temperature had dropped well below zero, and each breath came out in white clouds. I'd modified the chemical de-icer system, converting it into a weapon of last resort. Now I just needed to get the predator to commit to an attack. Base. I'm implementing my plan now, I said, my voice shaking from the cold. Greg's voice came through, concern evident. Seth, your vitals are critical. The rescue team is... No time. I cut him off. I need to focus. The submersible's damaged systems protested as I guided it forward. Warning lights still flashed across the console, but I'd managed to stabilize enough functions to maintain control. As I approached the thermal boundary, I could see the difference in water density where the warm current met the frigid Arctic waters. Through the viewport, I caught movement. A massive shadow took shape in the murky distance, growing larger by the second. The megalodon had spotted me. It surged forward from within the thermal current, its enormous body propelled by powerful muscle contractions. Its mouth gaped open, rows of serrated teeth visible even from this distance. It's coming straight for me, I reported, my heart racing despite the cold numbing my body. The giant shark accelerated, closing the gap between us with frightening speed. I kept the Polaris moving forward until the last possible moment, watching the ancient predator bear down on me. Its eyes were black and lifeless, yet somehow filled with primal intelligence. When it was less than 30 feet away, I slammed the controls in reverse. The Polaris shuddered and lurched backward, engines whining in protest. I retreated deeper into the freezing water, away from the thermal boundary. The megalodon followed, its massive body cutting through the water with deadly purpose. But after about 50 feet, it slowed, then stopped. It swam in place, clearly agitated, its tail sweeping back and forth as it tested the colder water. It's hesitating, I said into the radio. Just as I thought, it's not adapted to sustained exposure outside the thermal pocket. The creature turned slowly, swimming back toward the warmer water. I maneuvered the Polaris to a position just beyond what seemed to be the megalodon's comfort zone. My fingers fumbled with the control panel as I located the external lighting system. With a few quick adjustments, I cranked all available power to the floodlights, sending bright beams cutting through the dark water. Base. I'm attempting to provoke it, I explained, teeth chattering. Predators like this respond to visual stimuli and water disturbance. I pulsed the engines in rapid succession, creating strong vibrations and water displacement. The megalodon had retreated to the thermal boundary but remained visible, circling just inside the warm current. It seemed to be watching me, waiting. "Come on," I muttered to myself, pulsing the engines again. The shark's reaction was immediate. It turned sharply toward the Polaris, its powerful body tensing. The external lights illuminated its pale underside as it faced me directly. I continued the engine pulses, creating more vibration in the water. "It's working," I said. "The stimuli are triggering its hunting response." Greg's voice came through the speakers. "Seth, your oxygen levels are critical. You need to—" His words were cut off as the megalodon suddenly burst forward. It shot across the thermal boundary, massive jaws open wide, barreling toward the Polaris with explosive force. I braced myself against the control panel, hands gripping the edges. "It's coming!" I shouted. The impact came a second later. The megalodon slammed into the side of the submersible, its teeth scraping against the reinforced hull with a sound like metal being torn apart. The Polaris rocked violently, throwing me against my harness. Warning alarms blared throughout the cabin as new system failures registered on the console. "Hull integrity at 30%, I reported, fighting to regain control of the vessel. But it worked. It's fully committed to the attack now. The megalodon circled and struck again, this time hitting the underside of the Polaris. I could feel its massive body sliding against the hull, searching for purchase with those ancient teeth. The submersible shook with each powerful tail stroke as the predator maneuvered for another attack. With trembling hands, I reached for the modified controls I'd rigged to the de-icer system. The original purpose of the chemicals was to prevent ice buildup on external sensors, but I'd rerouted the entire payload to be discharged in a concentrated burst. "Activating modified de-icer system now," I said, voice steady despite my shivering body. I pressed the sequence of buttons I'd programmed and pulled the emergency override lever. The Polaris shuddered as the pressurized chemicals discharged from multiple ports along the hull. I swiveled in my seat to look through the viewport, watching as clouds of the chemical solution billowed into the water around the megalodon. The reaction was immediate and violent. The chemicals, designed to break down ice formations, created an extreme endothermic reaction in the already frigid water. The temperature around the megalodon plummeted rapidly, supercooling the water to levels that no living creature could withstand without specialized adaptations. Through the swirling chemical cloud, I watched the megalodon's reaction. At first, it continued its attack, seemingly unaffected. Then its movements became erratic, its massive body twisted unnaturally, powerful muscles contracting in spasms. The cold-blooded predator had no defense against the sudden temperature drop. "The chemical reaction is working," I reported, my breath fogging the viewport as I pressed closer to watch. "The water around it is supercooling." The megalodon's movements grew more desperate. It thrashed violently, trying to escape the chemical cloud. But the damage was already done. Its cold-blooded physiology couldn't adapt quickly enough to the extreme temperature change. I watched as the massive creature's movements slowed, its muscles seizing as thermal shock took hold. Within minutes, the prehistoric predator's thrashing ceased altogether. Its enormous body went limp, drifting in the water surrounded by the dissipating chemical cloud. The megalodon floated motionless outside the viewport, its dead eyes staring blankly through the glass. "Base," I said quietly. "The megalodon is neutralized. It's dead." I slumped back in my seat, exhaustion washing over me as the adrenaline faded. The cabin was still freezing, ice coating most surfaces, but the immediate danger had passed. Through the viewport, I could see the massive form of the megalodon beginning to sink slowly into the depths, its body already becoming part of the ancient darkness from which it had emerged. I watched the megalodon's massive form grow still, its once powerful body now locked in death. The chemical reaction had worked faster than I'd anticipated, the supercooled water seizing the creature's muscles and shutting down its biological functions within minutes. Its enormous bulk began to sink slowly into the dark abyss, a prehistoric apex predator returning to the depths, where it had somehow survived for millions of years. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I tried to steady myself against the control panel. The temperature inside the Polaris had plummeted well below freezing. Ice crystals had formed, not only on the interior surfaces, but on my eyelashes and beard. Each breath came out in thick white clouds that hung in the air before dissipating. My extremities had gone from painful to numb, a dangerous sign. Base, do you copy? Megalodon neutralized. I repeat, threat neutralized. My voice sounded slurred even to my own ears, another symptom of my advancing hypothermia. We copy, Seth. Gale's voice crackled through the speakers. What's your status? I glanced at the video recording equipment, checking that it had captured everything. The red light still glowed on the main camera panel. All recording equipment functional. We got everything. First confirmed Megalodon in modern times, and its end. A strange sadness washed over me despite my dire situation. Something miraculous had survived against all odds, only to die at human hands. Again. I'm steering back into the thermal current, I said, forcing my stiff fingers to grip the controls. The Polaris responded sluggishly, its damaged systems protesting with each command. Warning lights continued to flash across the console as I maneuvered the submersible toward the boundary of the warm water. The transition was visible through the viewport, a shimmering boundary where cold Arctic water met the warm thermal flow. As the Polaris crossed into the current, I felt the subtle change in water density through the hull. The exterior temperature gauge slowly climbed. 2 degrees, 0 degrees, pobosh 4 degrees, 8 degrees. In the current, I reported, beginning ascent procedures. Greg's voice came through next. Seth, rescue team is mobilized. ETA 90 minutes to your coordinates. How's the cabin temperature? I checked the gauge and shook my head, forgetting momentarily they couldn't see me. Still below freezing. Thermal regulation system is completely offline, but at least the hull is in warmer water now. What about your condition? Gale asked, her voice tight with concern. I paused, taking stock. My fingers were white at the tips with bluish discoloration spreading. Early frostbite. The cut above my eye had stopped bleeding, the blood frozen in place. My shivering had become violent and uncontrollable. I've been better. Start your ascent immediately, Gale ordered. Minimize all non-essential functions. I nodded to myself and began the ascent sequence, adjusting the ballast tanks to lighten the Polaris. The depth gauge showed 380 meters. It would be a long journey up. Ascending, I confirmed, watching the depth numbers slowly decrease. 370 meters. Ballast responding. The Polaris groaned ominously, the sound of metal under stress echoing through the cabin. A new warning flashed on the console. Hull integrity at 28%. Base, structural integrity is critical, I reported. Hull pressure warnings active. I diverted power from the external research equipment and lights to the structural reinforcement systems. The cabin grew darker, lit only by the glow of essential control panels and emergency lighting. The darkness felt appropriate somehow. A small submersible rising through the ancient depths, carrying its human cargo and scientific discoveries toward the light. At 300 meters, a loud crack reverberated through the hull, followed by a shower of sparks from an overhead panel. What was that? Greg demanded. Pressure fracture, I replied, scanning the damage readouts. Secondary bulkhead in Section 4. I redirected more power to structural support and manually adjusted the ballast to slow our ascent rate. Need to pace the pressure changes, or she'll break apart. My hands shook so badly I could barely operate the controls. I tucked them under my armpits for 30 seconds, trying to warm them enough to function. The slight warmth of my core body heat, what little remained, provided momentary relief. 250 meters, I reported, returning my hands to the controls. Oxygen levels at 17%. The ascent continued at an agonizing pace. Every system failure required immediate attention and workarounds. At 200 meters, the primary navigation system failed completely, forcing me to switch to manual backup. At 150 meters, the ballast control became erratic, requiring constant manual adjustments to maintain a steady rise. My consciousness began to waver. The edges of my vision darkened, and I found myself staring blankly at the control panel, forgetting what I was doing. "Seth? Seth, respond!" Gail's voice jolted me back to awareness. "Still here," I mumbled. 120 meters. "Stay with us," Greg urged. "Rescue team reports they've reached the station. They're prepping to receive you at the surface breach point." I nodded absently, focusing on the depth gauge. The numbers continued their slow decrease. 110, 100, 90. At 75 meters, I noticed something through the viewport, a faint blue-green glow filtering down from above, the first hints of surface light penetrating the water column. The sight gave me a surge of renewed determination. "I can see light," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're almost there," Gail encouraged. 50 more meters." The hull groaned again, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the entire structure. The Polaris was reaching its limit. "Diverting all remaining auxiliary power to hull integrity," I reported, shutting down several monitoring systems. The cabin grew even darker, but the structural integrity reading stabilized temporarily at 22%. My fingers had lost almost all sensation now. I operated the controls by sight rather than feel, watching my hands as if they belonged to someone else. The shivering had become so violent that I had to brace my arms against the console to maintain control. 40 meters. 35. I counted down as the Polaris continued its labored ascent. At 20 meters, the emergency backup generator failed with a loud pop and the acrid smell of burned wiring. The propulsion system sputtered, threatening to cut out entirely. "Propulsion failing," I reported, my words slurring together. "May need to use emergency ballast release for final ascent." "Do whatever you need to," Gail responded. "Just get to the surface." The light from above grew stronger, transforming from a dim glow to defined beams cutting through the water. I could make out the underside of the ice cap, the designated breach point where the station maintained an open access to the water. 10 meters. The propulsion system gave one final push before failing completely. I immediately hit the emergency ballast release, jettisoning the remaining ballast water. The Polaris lurched upward, rising the final few meters on its own buoyancy. The sensation of breaking through the surface was subtle, a slight change in the movement of the submersible, a different quality to the light. Then I saw it, the open air of the moon pool inside Station Theta, the bright lights of the facility, and the rescue team waiting on the platform. The Polaris bobbed in the water, damaged but triumphant. I'd made it back. Through the viewport, I could see the station crew rushing toward the submersible, preparing the docking clamps and emergency medical equipment. The frigid Arctic air that rushed in when they opened the hatch felt almost warm compared to the frozen interior of the Polaris. Strong hands reached inside to help me out, voices shouting medical instructions that seemed distant and unimportant. As they lifted me from the submersible, I glanced back at the control panel one last time. at the instruments that had recorded humanity's first encounter with a living megalodon. The discovery that would change our understanding of marine biology forever was safely stored in those damaged systems. I watched through the frosted viewport as Greg and the recovery team rushed toward the damaged Polaris. Their mouths moved in urgent commands I couldn't hear through the thick glass and metal separating us. My initial relief at reaching the surface faded as I realized my ordeal wasn't over. The hatch mechanisms had completely frozen shut during the ascent, leaving me trapped inside my own metal coffin. The cabin temperature had plummeted to -15°C, according to the only gauge still functioning. The rest of the control panel had gone dark minutes ago when the last backup systems failed. Ice crystals covered nearly every surface inside the cabin, including my eyebrows and eyelashes. Each labored breath produced a thick white cloud that hung in the air before dissipating. Greg reached the submersible first, his face tight with concern as he peered through the viewport. When our eyes met, his expression shifted to determined relief. He shouted something to the technicians behind him, pointing at the external hatch release. I tried to raise my hand in acknowledgement, but my limbs felt disconnected from my body, heavy and unresponsive. My thoughts moved slowly through a syrupy haze as hypothermia tightened its grip. I knew I needed to signal that I was still conscious. With tremendous effort, I lifted my frost-numb hand and weakly pounded on the viewport 3 times. The simple movement exhausted me, but Greg nodded in understanding. He and another technician immediately attacked the frozen hatch with tools, their movements urgent but methodical. Through the frosted glass, I watched them apply heat guns to the exterior seals while hammering at the ice formations around the edges. Their breath came out in white plumes in the cold air of the moon pool facility. My vision began to narrow, dark edges creeping in from the periphery. The faces and movements outside grew distorted, like watching through rippling water. I recognized the symptoms of severe hypothermia from my survival training: tunnel vision, confusion, drowsiness. My body was shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core temperature. I focused on the data drives secured in the waterproof case strapped to my chest. They contained the footage of the megalodon, proof of the most significant marine biology discovery in a century. The thought of losing this evidence kept me clinging to consciousness. A loud crack startled me back to alertness. The hatch seal had broken, and frigid Arctic air, still warmer than the cabin by at least 30 degrees, rushed in with a hiss. The relatively warm air created an instant fog inside the cabin as it met the supercooled interior. Greg's face appeared in the open hatch, his features twisted with worry. "Seth, can you hear me?" I tried to respond, but my lips barely moved, and the words came out slurred. Data. Secure." Strong hands reached in and grabbed me under the arms. The movement sent shards of pain through my frozen body. Greg pulled me from the submersible with careful urgency while shouting commands over his shoulder. My stiff limbs caught on the hatch opening, sending fresh waves of pain through me. "We've got him," Greg called out. "Medical team now." The medical staff converged on us as soon as I cleared the hatch, bringing thermal blankets and emergency heating packs. They worked quickly, wrapping the silver reflective material around my rigid body. One medic placed warming packs against my core while another checked my pulse and pupil response with a penlight. "Severe hypothermia. Possible frostbite on extremities," the medic reported clinically. "Core temperature dangerously low." Despite their efforts to treat me, I maintained a death grip on the waterproof case containing the data drives. When a medic tried to remove it to better wrap the thermal blanket around me, I clutched it tighter to my chest. No, I managed to stammer through chattering teeth. Don't. To take." Greg understood immediately. "Let him keep it," he told the medic. Those drives are important. The medic looked frustrated but worked around the case, wrapping the thermal blankets as best he could while leaving my arms clutched around my precious cargo. I tried to focus on the faces around me, but they blurred together in a kaleidoscope of concern. The pain in my hands had given way to a dangerous numbness that I recognized as frostbite. My fingers had turned waxy white where they gripped the case, but I couldn't bring myself to let go. Rapid footsteps approached across the metal deck. Dr. Gail Cruz hurried toward us, her normally composed features tight with worry and something else, scientific excitement. She pushed through the ring of medical personnel to kneel beside me. "Seth," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "Your report about the megalodon, was it accurate? Did you really find one?" Even through the fog of hypothermia, I understood the importance of her question. The scientific community would be skeptical. They would need more than my delirious testimony. Yes, I confirmed through violently chattering teeth. Living megalodon, trapped in the thermal sea current. Her eyes widened. "You're certain? A living specimen?" "The last of its kind," I managed to say. "Until today." The medical team lifted me onto a transport sled, strapping me down with practiced efficiency. One medic inserted an IV into my arm while another placed an oxygen mask over my face. The warm oxygen helped clear my mind slightly. "How did you neutralize it?" Dr. Cruz asked, walking alongside the sled as they began moving me toward the medical bay. I tried to explain through tremors that shook my entire body. Modified the de-icer system. Chemical reaction. Supercooled the water around it. Thermal shock. Dr. Cruz nodded, processing the information. "Ingenious adaptation," she murmured, though I wasn't sure if she was speaking to me or herself. Greg appeared on my other side, his hand on my shoulder. "The data drives," he said. "I'll secure them personally, Seth. I promise they'll be safe." I looked at him, trying to communicate my desperation through frost-numbed features. This footage was everything. Proof of an evolutionary miracle, a living fossil that had survived millions of years in isolation. With tremendous effort, I loosened my grip on the waterproof case. "Proof," I whispered as Greg carefully took the case from my frozen hands. "All there." "I've got it," Greg assured me, holding the case like it contained precious gems rather than digital files. "You focus on getting warm." The transport sled moved quickly through the research station's corridors. The lights overhead passed in a rhythmic pattern that lulled me deeper into semi-consciousness. I slipped in and out of awareness, catching fragments of medical jargon as the team communicated around me. Severe hypothermic state. Immediate rewarming protocol. Possible tissue damage to extremities. My last clear thought before darkness claimed me completely was of the megalodon, its ancient eyes studying me through the viewport, the prehistoric intelligence behind them, and the moment when chemical science had ended millions of years of evolution. The evidence of this extraordinary discovery was safely preserved, even as my consciousness faded into black. 2 days had passed since my rescue from the frozen Polaris. I sat propped up in the medical bay bed, both hands wrapped in thick white bandages that made them look twice their normal size. Similar dressings covered patches on my face, where frostbite had taken hold during those final desperate minutes in the submersible. The medical staff had assured me that I'd avoid permanent tissue damage, but the recovery process would be slow and uncomfortable. My fingers throbbed beneath their protective cocoons, a constant reminder of how close I'd come to losing them entirely. Across the room, Dr. Cruz, Greg, and 3 senior scientists from Station Theta huddled around a large monitor mounted on a movable stand. They'd wheeled it in an hour ago for what Greg had called the dozenth review of the footage I'd captured. I couldn't see the screen from my position, but I didn't need to. Every frame of that encounter was burned into my memory more permanently than any digital recording. There. Pause it there, Dr. Cruz said, pointing at the screen. Look at the gill structure. The evolutionary adaptations are remarkable. One of the scientists, Dr. Abernathy, a marine biologist who'd arrived at the station just yesterday, leaned closer to the screen. The thermal imaging confirms a consistent body temperature several degrees above the surrounding water. It's maintaining its internal heat despite being a cartilaginous fish. Play it forward to the hunting sequence, Greg suggested, glancing back at me with a quick smile. I shifted uncomfortably in the bed, trying to find a position that didn't put pressure on my various injuries. The medical staff had explained that beyond the frostbite, I'd suffered moderate hypothermia and oxygen deprivation. My lungs still felt raw when I took deep breaths, and random muscle tremors occasionally rippled through my legs. The room fell completely silent as the video showed the megalodon in perfect clarity, its massive form cutting through the thermal current with prehistoric grace. Even from across the room, I could make out the collective tension in their shoulders, the slight forward lean of their bodies as they watched the footage. It didn't matter how many times they'd seen it. The impact never diminished. "My God," Dr. Abernathy whispered, breaking the silence. "It's perfect. Undeniable proof." "And this is the attack sequence?" asked Dr. Winters, an oceanographer who specialized in deep-sea currents. Greg nodded. "Watch how it approaches the submersible. That's not random aggression. That's calculated hunting behavior." The footage continued playing, and I found myself tensing as if I were back inside the Polaris, feeling it shake under the megalodon's powerful strikes. My heart rate picked up, registering on the medical monitor beside my bed with a quickening beep. Dr. Cruz noticed and turned toward me. "Seth, do you want us to continue this elsewhere?" I shook my head. "No. I need to see it too." She studied my face for a moment before nodding and turning back to the screen. "The chemical reaction was faster than I expected," I said, drawing their attention back to me. I'd calculated at least 30 seconds before thermal shock would take effect, but it was almost immediate. Greg paused the footage, freezing the image of the megalodon mid-thrash as the chemical cloud enveloped it. "Your modification to the de-icer system was brilliant. Desperate, but brilliant." "We're already preparing a proper expedition," Dr. Winters said, turning toward me. "2 submersibles with specialized recovery equipment. We need tissue samples, DNA, everything we can get from the remains before decomposition advances too far." "How soon?" I asked. 3 days, Greg answered. "The technical team is retrofitting the Arcturus and Vostok with reinforced collection equipment and improved thermal regulation systems." He smiled wryly at that last part. "Nobody wants a repeat of your experience." Dr. Cruz walked over and sat in the chair beside my bed. "Research institutions worldwide are clamoring for access to the discovery, Seth. We've received calls from Woods Hole, Scripps, the Russian Academy of Sciences, even private research foundations offering substantial funding." "And?" I prompted. "And our team will maintain control of the initial research phase," she said firmly. "It's our discovery, your discovery, and we're going to ensure the scientific process is followed correctly. No rushing, no premature conclusions." I nodded, relieved. The thought of external groups swooping in and taking over the research had worried me since I'd regained consciousness in the medical bay. What about the thermal vent ecosystem? It's not just the megalodon. There's an entire isolated biosphere down there. "That's phase 2, Greg said, crossing his arms. After we recover samples from the megalodon, we'll conduct a comprehensive survey of the thermal pocket. The preliminary data you collected suggests dozens of potentially undocumented species. My gaze drifted toward the window on the far wall of the medical bay. From my bed, I could see the vast white expanse of the ice cap stretching to the horizon, its surface glittering under the pale Arctic sun. Somewhere beneath that frozen landscape, almost 400 meters down, lay the remains of a creature that had survived millions of years in perfect isolation, only to meet modern human technology in its final moments. "We're establishing a permanent research station directly above the thermal vent," Dr. Cruz continued. "The National Science Foundation has already approved emergency funding, and 3 more research teams are flying in next week." "I want to be part of the recovery expedition," I said, looking back at her. Dr. Cruz frowned. "Seth, you nearly died. Your hands—" "Will heal," I interrupted. "I don't need to pilot. I just need to be there." She exchanged glances with Greg, who shrugged. "It's his discovery." "We'll see what the medical team says," Dr. Cruz conceded. "But only as an observer, not as part of the operational team." I nodded, satisfied with that compromise. The scientists returned to their analysis of the footage, pointing out features and discussing evolutionary implications that would rewrite textbooks around the world. Their excitement was palpable, filling the sterile medical bay with an energy that contrasted sharply with the clinical environment. As they continued their discussion, my thoughts drifted to the moment I'd first seen the megalodon through the Polaris viewport. There had been a strange connection. Predator recognizing predator across millions of years of evolutionary divergence. In that moment, I'd felt something primordial and humbling, a recognition of how small humanity's timeline was compared to Earth's ancient history. "Seth?" Greg's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Did you hear the question?" I blinked, focusing on the group, who had all turned to look at me. "Sorry, I was somewhere else." Dr. Abernathy was asking about the megalodon's behavior at the thermal boundary. "You reported it wouldn't cross into the colder water until provoked?" "That's right," I said, sitting up straighter despite the protest from my aching body. "It would approach the boundary, test it, and retreat. It seemed to understand exactly where the warm current ended. That's what gave me the idea for the trap." Dr. Abernathy made notes on his tablet. "Remarkable spatial awareness. And this was consistent behavior?" "Every time," I confirmed, "until I provoked it into attacking." The discussion continued, but I found my attention drawn back to the window and the ice beyond. As the others debated taxonomic classification and evolutionary pathways, I reflected on my narrow escape. The memory of those frozen hours inside the Polaris still sent chills through me that had nothing to do with the temperature in the medical bay. I'd come within minutes of death, saved only by a desperate gamble in the station's rescue team. I felt grateful to be alive, to be sitting here with bandaged hands instead of frozen at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. Yet beneath that gratitude ran a current of something else, a familiar sensation I recognized from years of scientific exploration. It was the pull of discovery, the knowledge that if one ancient predator had survived in isolation beneath the ice, other secrets might be preserved in Earth's unexplored regions. Mysteries waiting in deep ocean trenches, beneath polar ice, or in remote cave systems, waiting for someone brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to find them